The airport was full of noise and light and people moving in every direction, and in the middle of all that stood a man named Tom Miller, with his little daughter Emma clutching his hand tightly, as if she was afraid to let go. And Tom tried to smile at her, but inside he was already tired from a long week of work and worries and a heavy heart that never seemed to rest. It was a big day for Emma. Her very first flight, she had been talking about it for weeks, her tiny backpack bouncing as she walked. Her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at the planes outside the glass wall. She kept saying, "Daddy, we are really flying, right?" And Tom nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, sweetheart. We are flying today. Just you and me." Tom was not a rich man. He was a single father working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and this short trip was a small promise he had made to Emma after her birthday. He had saved little by little, skipping lunches and taking extra shifts. And now, here they were finally, ready to fly somewhere new, somewhere peaceful, just a father and his little girl. At the check-in counter stood a tall man in a sharp blue suit. His smile was wide but cold like polished glass. He was surrounded by airline staff laughing and talking loudly. This man was Mr. Collins, the CEO of the airline, and he was there for a media event, cameras flashing every few seconds as reporters asked questions about the success of his company. Tom stepped forward holding his worn suitcase, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his shoes old but clean. He spoke gently to the clerk at the counter, saying that his seat was far from his daughter's, and asking if there was any chance they could sit together. It was a simple request, said with kindness and a hopeful smile, but before the clerk could answer, Mr. Collins turned around and looked at him with raised eyebrows. The CEO chuckled loud enough for others to hear, and said in a joking tone, "Maybe next time, sir, you can buy 2 seats together if you can afford." The people around him laughed softly, trying to please their boss, but Tom's face turned red and Emma's small hand tightened in his. The sound of that laughter echoed in his ears like thunder in a small room. Tom lowered his voice and said, "I just want to sit next to my daughter, sir. She is only 6. She gets scared easily." But Mr. Collins waved his hand like he was brushing away dust and said, "Rules are rules, sir. We have paying customers waiting behind you, too. Please move along and take your seat." The clerk looked uncomfortable but followed orders, printing Tom's ticket quietly and handing it over with an apologetic glance. Tom nodded without a word. He didn't want to make a scene. Emma looked up at him, her big brown eyes full of confusion. She whispered softly, "Daddy, why is that man being mean?" Tom smiled weakly and said, "It's okay, honey. Some people forget how to be kind." As they turned to leave, a few passengers who had seen everything whispered to each other. Some shook their heads, others stayed silent. No one wanted to argue with the man who owned the airline, but far away near the gate, a man in a pilot's uniform had been watching carefully. He was tall, calm, with kind eyes under his cap. His name tag read, Captain Rogers. Captain Rogers had seen arrogance many times in his career, but something about this scene touched him deeply. He saw the way the father stood tall, trying to protect his daughter's feelings. Even as he was mocked in public, he saw the small girl trying to stay brave even when she didn't understand why her father looked hurt. Tom and Emma walked toward the waiting area, Emma's teddy bear hanging from her backpack. Tom sat down beside her, trying to distract her, pointing to the planes outside the window. "Look, sweetheart, that one is huge. Maybe that's ours." She smiled a little, her innocence shining through the sadness. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins laughed with reporters telling stories about business growth and luxury cabins. His voice filled the air like static noise. He didn't notice the pilot who had been watching him quietly, nor did he notice the way people avoided his gaze now. After seeing his cruelty, the energy in the air had changed slightly, like a silent storm waiting to form. Captain Rogers spoke softly to a flight attendant nearby, asking who the man and little girl were. The attendant explained the story quickly, shaking her head sadly. The captain nodded, his jaw tight. He said in a calm voice, "Sometimes it's not the plane that needs fixing, it's the people flying it." Then he turned toward the boarding gate, knowing deep inside that this flight was about to teach everyone something unexpected. When boarding began, Tom helped Emma climb the steps. She held her bear close to her chest, her small feet moving carefully as she looked back at the tall, shiny plane. The air smelled of rain and jet fuel. and for a moment Tom looked up at the sky, whispering a small prayer for peace. He didn't know what was waiting ahead, but he hoped this trip would be a memory of joy for his little girl. At the same time, Mr. Collins walked ahead, proudly shaking hands with staff, smiling for cameras, his suit spotless, his confidence unshaken. But behind that, pride, a story was already beginning to form, a story that would soon turn the tables in a way no one could imagine. And as the door of the plane closed and the engines began to roar, Captain Rogers sat in the cockpit, his eyes sharp, his heart steady. He remembered the look on that little girl's face and whispered under his breath, "Some lessons come at 30,000 feet, and this one will be remembered by all." The airplane stood on the runway like a giant bird ready to rise, and the sound of engines filled the air with deep, rumbling energy. Passengers hurried to their seats while flight attendants guided them with soft smiles and calm voices. The world outside was gray with clouds, but inside the cabin, hearts were full of different emotions: excitement, fear, and a bit of wonder. Tom Miller walked slowly down the aisle with his little daughter Emma, who held her teddy bear tightly. Her small eyes filled with both excitement and worry. She had never been on a plane before, and the sound of the engines made her grip her father's arm even tighter. Tom smiled, trying to stay calm even though his chest felt heavy from what happened at the counter. He whispered gently to her, "Everything is okay, sweetheart. We are just going on an adventure, remember." Their seats were far from each other. Tom had been placed several rows behind Emma because of the CEO's cruel refusal. The flight attendant had tried to help, but the system was locked and the order had come from above. Tom sat down with his head low and his hands shaking slightly. He kept looking over the seats to see Emma, who waved at him with a brave smile, trying to act strong. At the front of the plane, Mr. Collins sat comfortably in first class, sipping juice and laughing loudly with another businessman, his expensive watch glittering in the cabin light. He spoke about money, success, and how some people should know their place. He bragged that he had built the airline from nothing and that no one could question his authority. The attendants nodded politely, but their eyes showed discomfort. They had all seen what he did at the airport. In the cockpit, Captain Rogers sat quietly with his co-pilot, checking every switch and light, his mind focused. But part of his thoughts still replayed the scene from earlier. The little girl, the father's calm voice, the CEO's mocking words. He couldn't shake it off. Something about it had left a deep mark in his heart. He took a slow breath and said to his co-pilot, "Let's make this flight safe and smooth. We have important passengers today, all of them." The plane began to move forward slowly, wheels rolling faster, until with a powerful roar, it lifted into the air. Emma gasped in wonder, pressing her face against. The window clouds surrounded them like soft white mountains. Her small voice whispered, "Wow, Daddy, we are flying." Tom smiled from his seat, even though his eyes felt wet. He nodded across the aisle and mouthed the words, "I love you." She smiled back after. A few minutes, the seatbelt signs turned off and passengers began to relax. Some reading, some chatting, some sleeping. The attendants moved gracefully down the aisles, offering water and snacks. One of them stopped by Tom and smiled kindly. She said, "Your daughter is doing great. She is drawing pictures of airplanes." Tom laughed softly. "That's my brave girl," he said. Meanwhile, in first class, Mr. Collins was talking loudly again about his new deal with investors, about luxury seats, and about how only people who deserve comfort should have it. He was enjoying the attention, unaware that a few passengers nearby were recording him quietly on their phones. Captain Rogers decided to walk through the cabin to observe, as he often did. He believed in connecting with passengers to make them feel safe and cared for. When he reached the middle section, he saw Tom again, the same man from the airport, sitting quietly and smiling at his daughter through the seats. Rogers stopped beside him for a second and said softly, "Everything all right, sir?" Tom looked up surprised and nodded. "Yes, Captain, thank you. She is just a bit nervous." Rogers smiled gently and said, "She has nothing to worry about, sir. She has a strong father watching over her." Tom felt something warm in his chest for the first time that day. He felt seen, respected, even comforted. He thanked the captain and watched him walk away toward the back of the plane, calm, steady, like a man who carried peace wherever he went. But the peace did not last long. As the plane entered a higher altitude, a soft rumble began under their feet. Passengers looked around. The lights flickered once, twice. The plane shook slightly, not enough to cause panic, but enough to make hearts skip. Beats Captain Rogers immediately returned to the cockpit, checking the control panels. He spoke calmly into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through light turbulence. Please remain seated." Emma gripped her teddy tighter and looked at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. She whispered, "Is it okay, Daddy?" And he mouthed, "Yes, honey, it's just a little bump." The shaking slowed, and soon the cabin felt stable again. People sighed in relief, and some even laughed nervously, but Captain Rogers felt something strange. A small warning light blinking faintly on his control panel, something that shouldn't be there. He kept his voice calm as he spoke to his co-pilot. "Let's keep an eye on that. It could be nothing, but it could be something." At the same time, in first class, Mr. Collins demanded another drink. He looked annoyed by the short turbulence. He said loudly, "These pilots better know what they are doing. I pay them enough." His voice carried down the aisle. Some passengers frowned. Others whispered quietly. One elderly woman said softly, "Money can't buy respect, dear. Someone should tell him that." Tom looked at Emma, sleeping now, her little head resting against the window. And he thought about life. How some people had everything and yet no kindness, while others had little but hearts full of love. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for this moment. Even with all its pain, it still feels like love." Up in the cockpit, Captain Rogers stared at the light, blinking steadily now, a soft beeping sound filling the cabin. His calm face grew serious. Something was wrong. Something that could test everyone on board, including the man who thought he owned the sky. And as the clouds thickened outside and the engines hummed deeper, the story that began with humiliation was now turning into a test of courage and truth, a flight that would soon reveal what kind of hearts truly rise when everything begins to fall. The sky outside the airplane had turned darker with thick gray, clouds swirling like giant waves, and the soft hum of the engines that once sounded steady now carried a low, uneasy vibration that made passengers glance around in worry. Captain Rogers sat in the cockpit, his calm eyes scanning every light on the control panel. One of them was blinking red faintly, like a heartbeat that was getting faster with each second. He spoke in a low voice to his co-pilot, saying, "Keep your eyes on the altitude reading. Something is not right here." And the co-pilot nodded, his face pale under the blue light of the instruments. They both checked switches and numbers again. But the warning remained. It was not a big emergency yet, but it was serious enough to keep every muscle tight with focus. Back in the cabin, the passengers began to feel the change in the air. A strange silence spread through the aisles. People who had been chatting softly now held their cups carefully. Flight attendants moved quicker, but with calm smiles, doing everything they could to hide their own fear. Emma looked out of the window, her little voice breaking the silence. "Daddy, why are we inside the clouds? I can't see anything." Tom reached across the aisle, trying to smile, and said, "It's okay, sweetheart. Clouds are soft like cotton, remember? They can't hurt us." But even he could feel something strange, the way the plane trembled just slightly, the way the air seemed thicker. He looked at the attendants walking by, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes, and his heart began to race. He wanted to be near Emma to hold her hand, but his seatbelt kept him trapped. At the front, Mr. Collins, the CEO of the airline, sat with a frown on his face, his luxury drink half spilled from the last shake. He called out angrily to a flight attendant, asking what was going on, his voice sharp and full of command. The young attendant replied gently, "Sir, the captain has it under control. Please stay seated for your safety." But Mr. Collins waved her off, saying, "Nonsense. I demand to know. Right now. Do you know who I am?" His loud voice carried through the quiet cabin, and people began to look at him, some with annoyance, some with disbelief. Even in fear, he could not stop trying to prove power. The same power that meant nothing in the sky, where money could not buy calm or control. Captain Rogers made a quick announcement over the intercom, his voice calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a small technical issue, but everything is under control. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. There is no danger at this time. Thank you for your cooperation." His tone was firm but kind, the kind of voice that carried strength through fear. Tom felt a little calmer hearing it. He whispered to Emma, "See, sweetheart, the captain. Said everything is fine. She nodded slowly, hugging her teddy bear close and resting her head against the window, the small vibration of the plane making her eyelids heavy. But Tom could not relax. He kept glancing forward, wondering what was really happening in the cockpit. Captain Rogers checked the data again. The co-pilot said, "The fuel pressure in engine 2 is unstable, sir." And Rogers nodded, saying, "Reduce power to that engine and keep monitoring it." We may have to divert the flight, he thought. Quickly calculating distance, weather, and airports, he had done this for years, but something about this flight felt different. Heavier, like it carried more than just passengers, maybe lessons waiting to be learned. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins began muttering, loudly again, "This is ridiculous. How can there be a problem on my plane? I will fire whoever is responsible." His words were sharp enough to slice the air around him. A woman sitting nearby turned to him and said softly, "Maybe you should pray instead of threatening people, sir." He glared at her but had no answer. Tom noticed the flight attendants whispering in the galley. One of them looked nervous, holding a radio to her ear. Tom's heart beat faster. He thought of Emma alone a few rows away, and his hands gripped the armrests. He wanted to shout, to ask what was wrong. But he stopped himself, knowing fear would only scare his little girl more. So he took a deep breath and whispered under his breath, "It's going to be okay." The turbulence returned. Stronger this time, the plane dipped slightly, then rose again. Gasps filled the air. Emma woke up crying, "Daddy," and he called back, "I'm here, honey. Just hold tight." The seatbelt. Light flashed bright red, and flight attendants hurried down the aisle. Checking every buckle, one of them stopped near Emma and smiled reassuringly. "Sweetie, you are doing so great. Just hold your bear tight, okay?" Captain Rogers was busy making quick decisions. He radioed the control tower, explaining the situation. Engine 2 losing pressure, requesting priority landing. The tower responded with instructions, and Rogers confirmed, his voice steady, but his eyes sharp, focused, every nerve on the mission to land safely. His co-pilot said, "Sir, should we tell the passengers the full situation?" And Rogers shook his head. "Not yet. Fear spreads faster than truth. Let's keep them calm. We can handle this." But the storm outside was growing stronger. Lightning flashed across the clouds, and the plane shook harder than before. People screamed softly. Others prayed. Emma closed her eyes, whispering, "Daddy, make it stop." And Tom's heart broke, hearing that helpless plea in first class. Mr. Collins grabbed the armrest, shouting, "Someone do something. I'm not dying on my own plane." His voice high and desperate. The same man who mocked a single father, now shaking in fear like a child captain. Rogers gripped the controls, his voice firm. "We're bringing her down. Easy. Hold on, everyone." The engines roared, lightning flashed again, and in that moment time seemed to freeze inside that metal bird. Flying through chaos, hearts were tested, truths revealed, and somewhere between fear and faith, the real story of who people truly were began to unfold. The storm outside raged louder. Now the sky was a mix of gray and flashing light. The airplane trembled with every gust of wind, and the sound of thunder rolled like distant drums. Passengers gripped their armrests, praying silently, hoping that each shake would be the last. Captain Rogers sat in the cockpit, calm but alert, his hands steady on the controls as he guided the plane through the rough air. The blinking red light still warned them that Engine 2 was failing slowly, and he knew he had to act fast before fear took over completely in the cabin. The tension was thick, the air heavy with worry. One cry would rise, then fade, one whisper would travel, then vanish into silence. Emma clutched her teddy bear, her little lips trembling. "Daddy, is the plane broken?" she asked. In a shaking voice, Tom reached over the seat, stretching his arm as far as he could, and said softly, "No, sweetheart. It's just tired like us. It just needs a little rest." She tried to smile, believing him, because in her small heart, her father's words were stronger than the storm. The plane jolted suddenly, and a few screams filled the air trays, slid off tables, cups rolled on the floor, and the overhead lights flickered again. One of the attendants lost her balance, but Captain Rogers' voice came quickly over the intercom. "Steady and sure, ladies and gentlemen. Please stay calm. Keep your seatbelts fastened. We are in control. Thank you for staying brave with us." Tom felt the calm in that voice. He looked around at the passengers. Some were praying quietly, some were crying Softly others stared out the windows as if searching for safety in the clouds. Then his eyes fell on Mr. Collins, who was standing up in first class yelling angrily at the crew, his face red with rage and fear. Mr. Collins shouted, "I demand to speak. To the captain right now, I own this airline, you hear me? I should be protected first." His voice was sharp and cold. He pushed past one of the attendants who tried to stop him. She said, "Sir, please sit down for your safety," but he brushed her away with a wave of his hand, shouting, "Do not tell me what to do, I am in charge here." Everyone watched as his arrogance filled the cabin louder than the storm. Tom shook his head quietly, thinking how strange it was that power could make a man so small in moments like this, while the CEO raged and shouted. Tom unbuckled for a second, helping the old woman beside him who was struggling to reach her bag. He said kindly, "It's okay, ma'am. I'll get that for you." She looked at him with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Thank you, young man." A flight attendant saw this and smiled faintly. Despite the fear around them, she said, "Sir, please keep helping us if you can. You are calm, and they listen to you." Tom nodded. He didn't think of himself as brave, but something inside him refused to let panic win. In the cockpit, Captain Rogers was preparing for descent. He spoke into his headset, telling the tower, "We are losing fuel pressure faster than expected. Preparing emergency approach. Notify ground crews." Then he turned to his co-pilot and said, "Once we stabilize, I want you to go check on the cabin. Keep them calm. We need unity right now, not chaos." The co-pilot nodded and left the cockpit, walking into the cabin where fear was heavy. He saw Mr. Collins still shouting, saying, "I will sue everyone for this disaster. This is unacceptable." He pointed at Tom, who was helping passengers, and said, "That man should sit down. He's not crew. He's nobody." The co-pilot's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the CEO and said firmly, "Sir, please take your seat. We need order, not noise. Your behavior is not helping anyone." The words hit like cold water. Mr. Collins froze for a second, but then sat down, muttering under his breath. The passengers exchanged looks, some shaking, their heads, others whispering, "How can someone be so heartless?" Emma was crying softly now, and Tom kept talking to her about the stars above the clouds, about how brave she was and how proud he was of her. She smiled a little and said, "I'm not scared anymore, Daddy, because you're here." Tom's throat tightened, but he smiled back. That small smile filled him with courage. Stronger than any fear, Captain Rogers came out for a moment, walking down the aisle. His tall figure calm, his eyes full of strength. He stopped near Tom and said, "Thank you for helping, sir. People follow calm hearts in chaos." Tom nodded, saying, "Just doing what any dad would do." The captain looked at Emma and smiled softly, then turned his gaze toward Mr. Collins, who sat sulking in his seat. Captain Rogers paused for a long moment, looking at the man who once laughed at a father for being poor. He said quietly but clearly, "Sir, leadership is not about owning things, it's about standing tall when others fall." Then he walked away, heading back to the cockpit, leaving a silence behind that felt heavier than thunder. The attendants whispered to each other as they continued their work, their hands trembling, but their spirits rising because they had seen something shift in that. Cabin people were helping one another, strangers passing tissues, sharing comforting words, even holding hands across aisles. The storm outside was strong, but the kindness inside the cabin had started to grow stronger. Tom looked at his daughter again and whispered, "See, sweetheart, even when people are scared, they can still be kind." She nodded slowly, her small fingers holding his tightly, and for the first time since the flight began, the cabin felt warm, like the storm had no power there. As the plane began to descend through thick clouds, Captain Rogers prepared for landing. The ground was still far away, but hope was closer than ever, and while the engines roared and lightning flashed again, the real storm was no longer outside. It was inside, the hearts of those learning what it meant to care, what it meant to be human, what it meant to lead without pride and follow without fear. The sky began to clear as the plane broke through the thick layer of storm clouds, and a pale golden light poured through the windows like a gentle promise of safety. The passengers gasped softly when they saw the first signs of land below, small green fields, rivers shining like ribbons of silver, and the faint outline of a city growing larger with every passing second. Captain Rogers held the controls firm, his calm voice guiding his co-pilot. Check gear, check flaps. Keep your eyes on the runway. We are almost home. The sound of the engines filled the cabin again, but this time it was steady, sure-like, a heart that had found its rhythm again. Tom held Emma's hand across the aisle, whispering softly, "You see, sweetheart, the sky always clears if you wait long enough." She smiled weakly, her eyes red from crying. But there was a glow of courage on her face that made her father's heart swell with pride. Mr. Collins sat in silence now. His expensive suit wrinkled his face pale, his earlier pride melted away by fear. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest, his eyes darting toward the cockpit. Again and again he had spent the last hour quietly praying under his breath, though he would never admit it. The arrogance had drained from his voice, leaving only the sound of a man unsure of himself for the first time. The flight attendants walked through the aisle, checking seatbelts and comforting passengers. One of them stopped by Tom's seat and said softly, "Thank you for helping everyone back there, sir. You kept people calm more than you know." Tom smiled tiredly. "I just did what any parent would." She nodded and moved on, but her eyes glistened as she looked back because she had seen true strength. Not from money, not from power, but from heart. Captain Rogers spoke over the intercom, his voice deep and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please stay seated, keep your seatbelts fastened. We will touch down safely. Thank you for staying brave with us through this flight." The cabin filled with a quiet buzz of relief. People whispered prayers of thanks, some held hands, others wiped away tears. Emma looked out the window again, her small voice full of wonder. "Daddy, look the ground, it's getting closer." Tom smiled and nodded. "That's right, sweetheart. We made it." The wheels touched down with a heavy thud and the plane rolled down the runway, slowing slowly until the engines sighed into silence and the cabin burst into claps and cheers. People crying, laughing, hugging strangers. It was the sound of life itself, a sound that washed away all fear and left only gratitude. Captain Rogers and his co-pilot looked at each other with small smiles. They had done it together against storm and failure. They had landed safe. Rogers unbuckled his seatbelt, took a deep breath and said quietly, "Now comes the real landing, not with the plane but with people." He stepped out of the cockpit. His uniform slightly wrinkled, his face calm but tired. He walked slowly down the aisle as passengers clapped for him. Some stood to thank him, but he only nodded humbly and said, "Thank you for staying calm. You were all part of this landing together." Then his eyes found Mr. Collins sitting stiffly in his seat, his head down, his pride shattered. The cameras from the media waiting outside could be seen through the window, flashes of light already preparing to greet the famous CEO who had survived a mid-air scare. Rogers stopped beside him, and for a long moment said nothing. The silence was heavy, thick enough to make everyone turn their heads to watch. Finally, Captain Rogers spoke, his voice calm but strong enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Sir, I have a question." He paused, looking straight into the CEO's eyes. When danger came, who was the leader? Was it the man with the title, or the father who helped everyone? "Stay calm." His words echoed through the cabin like thunder after lightning. The passengers froze. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Collins looked up, his mouth opening, but no words came out. His face flushed red. His eyes darted toward Tom, who sat a few rows back, holding his daughter. The CEO tried to speak, but his throat closed. Nothing he could say would change what everyone had just witnessed. Rogers continued, his tone steady. "Sir, power means nothing if it disappears in fear. Leadership means standing for others even when no one stands for you." Then he turned and faced the passengers. "Thank you all for reminding me that courage wears no uniform. It comes from the heart." He smiled gently, then nodded toward Tom and Emma, saying, "Some heroes don't sit in the cockpit. They sit quietly holding a child's hand." The cabin burst into quiet applause. This time not out of relief, but out of respect. People turned to Tom, some wiping their eyes. Even Emma didn't fully understand, but she clapped along, smiling proudly at her dad, saying, "Daddy, everyone's clapping for you." Tom shook his head, smiling softly. "No, sweetheart, they're clapping for kindness." Mr. Collins sat frozen, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His fame, his money, his pride meant nothing here. In this moment, he was just a man who had seen himself through others' eyes and realized how small he had become. He lowered his head, whispering words that no one could hear, as the doors opened and passengers began to leave. Reporters rushed in shouting questions, but none aimed at the CEO. Their cameras pointed at Captain Rogers and Tom. The pilot spoke to one reporter, quietly saying the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside the human heart. Today we all learned who truly flies with honor. Outside, the runway shimmered under the afternoon sun, and as Tom carried Emma down the steps, her small teddy bear still in her arms, she looked up at the captain and waved, saying, "Thank you, Mr. Pilot." He smiled warmly, waving back, saying, "No, sweetheart, thank you for being brave." And as the cameras flashed and the world watched, a simple truth filled the air that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and sometimes the greatest lesson comes not from the man who owns the sky, but from the one who walks through the storm with love in his hands. The airport was buzzing with noise and flashing cameras. People surrounded the plane, cheering for the brave passengers, and crew reporters rushed forward, holding microphones, shouting questions. But all eyes turned toward one man and one little girl, walking hand in hand, Tom Miller and his daughter Emma. They looked tired but peaceful, their faces calm under the bright sunlight. Emma still clutched her teddy bear close, her small steps matching her father's, as if they had walked through a storm together and found sunshine waiting on the other side. Behind them, Captain Rogers stepped out of the plane. His uniform slightly rumpled, his hair messy from hours of tension, yet his eyes carried a glow of quiet pride. He was not a man who needed applause, but when the crowd began to clap for him, he simply nodded humbly and said, "Thank you to everyone who stayed strong. You all made it through together." Mr. Collins followed soon after, his face pale, and his once confident stride now slow and uncertain. Reporters turned their cameras toward him, shouting questions about the emergency flight and his behavior during the storm. But he could not speak. He just looked around at the passengers who had witnessed his arrogance, and then at the captain who had spoken truth into his heart. For the first time in years, the captain walked over to Tom, who was kneeling beside Emma, fixing her small backpack. He extended his hand and said with a warm smile, "You did more than most men would in that cabin, sir. You stayed calm when fear was loud, and that made all the difference." Tom stood slowly, shaking his hand, saying, "Thank you, Captain. I just did what any father would do, but you saved us all." Captain Rogers shook his head gently, saying, "No, Tom, you saved hope, and that is sometimes harder." People nearby clapped softly again, touched by the quiet exchange between two men, one who flew the plane and one who carried courage without wings. The moment felt still, like time itself wanted to listen. Emma tugged her father's sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, is he a hero?" Tom smiled and said, "Yes, sweetheart, but heroes are everywhere, even on seat 17 next to the window." Later that evening, news of the flight spread across every channel, across every screen. Headlines read, "Airline CEO, humbled by single father and captain's powerful words touch millions." The video of the moment when Captain Rogers asked his question went viral across the world. Viewed by millions in just hours, people commented about kindness, humility, and how real respect cannot be bought. At the airline headquarters, board members held an emergency meeting. They had watched the video too. The shame on their CEO's face was now the face of their brand, and the world demanded answers. By morning, Mr. Collins stepped before cameras at a press conference, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I was wrong. I acted without kindness, and I forgot what true leadership means." He turned to Tom and Emma, who had been invited by the airline, and said in front of everyone, "Sir, I owe you and your daughter an apology." Tom looked uncomfortable standing in the spotlight, but he nodded and said quietly, "We all make mistakes, sir. What matters is what we learn from them." The room filled with applause. The CEO looked down, wiping his eyes. The man who once mocked a single father was now learning humility, the hardest lesson of all. Captain Rogers stood nearby, watching it all with a soft smile. He didn't care for fame or praise. He cared that the world was reminded of decency, of courage of heart. He approached the podium and said in a firm, calm voice, Today is not about blame, it's about learning that every person has value. Every story matters and kindness costs nothing, but can change everything. The crowd erupted in. Cheers and cameras flashed brighter than ever before. In the weeks that followed, the airline launched a new program called Hearts in the Sky, offering free upgrades for families traveling together and scholarships for single parents working in aviation. They named the first scholarship after Emma's teddy bear, calling it the Brave Bear Award. Emma laughed when she heard it, hugging her bear and saying, "Daddy, my bear is famous now." Tom laughed too, a laugh full of warmth and disbelief. Life slowly returned to normal, but something inside Tom had changed. People in his neighborhood recognized him and thanked him for reminding them that love is the strongest thing a person can carry. He still worked hard. He still faced bills and challenges, but every time he looked at Emma, he remembered that storm and how it brought light into their lives. One quiet morning, months later, Tom and Emma were sitting on a park bench watching planes fly above the sky, bright blue and endless. Emma looked up and said, "Daddy, do you think Captain Rogers is flying that one?" Tom smiled. "Maybe, sweetheart. Maybe he's up there helping someone else through a storm right now." She leaned her head on his arm, whispering, "I want to be brave like him one day." And Tom said, "You already are, my little pilot." At the same time, in another airport, Captain Rogers prepared for another flight. He stood at the gate, greeting passengers with the same calm smile he always carried. One of them, a little boy holding his father's hand, looked up and said, "Are you the pilot from the video?" Rogers chuckled softly, saying, "Yes, young man, I am. But remember this, the real hero was a dad just like yours." And as the boy smiled wide and the engines began to roar again, the captain looked out the window, the sun glinting off the metal wings, and whispered to himself, "Storms come and go, but the heart always knows where home is, high above the earth." Another journey began, the clouds parting like curtains, revealing a sky full of second chances, and somewhere below, a single father and his daughter looked up smiling, knowing that sometimes it takes a storm to remind the world what true respect really means.